The snow had been falling for 3 hours when Cormac Vale opened his front door and found a heavy-set young woman standing on his steps, holding the leash of a dog he'd given up for dead. She wasn't from his world. He could tell that in half a second, the way he could tell most things, by the cracked red knuckles, the coat that was 2 winters too thin, the leash itself, which wasn't a leash at all, but a child's shoelace knotted 3 times and tested for strength. Behind her, the driveway ran a 1/4 mile down to a gate that hadn't been opened by a stranger in years. And beyond the gate, the road ran 10 miles back into a part of Providence that people like him owned, but never walked. She'd walked it, in 9 below zero cold. On a Saturday morning that hadn't started yet for anyone with a choice about it. Cormac Vale was 37 years old, and he ran the kind of business that didn't have a name on any door, the kind that made a city go quiet when his car turned onto a street. And in 10 years, no one had come to his house uninvited and left the way they'd come. He looked at the dog. Shep had been Maeve's dog, and Maeve had been gone 16 months, and Cormac hadn't moved a single thing in that house since the morning the hospital called. Not her books, not her coat by the side door, not the water bowl he still filled out of a habit he wouldn't let himself examine. The dog had wandered out an unlatched door before dawn, and he had sat at his kitchen table for 22 minutes, deciding whether he was even allowed to want it back. Now here it was, returned by a woman whose name he didn't know, whose hands were shaking, who looked at him without an ounce of the fear he was used to seeing. He offered to drive her home. She said she'd walk. He told her it was 10 miles and still snowing. She said she knew. And there was something in the way she turned and started back down those steps, shoulders forward, refusing to look back, that put a cold hand on the back of his neck, because he'd seen a woman walk exactly like that once before, every single week, all the way to the place she went to be treated, and she'd told him that if he ever drove her, she'd be letting the sickness win. He didn't know yet that the woman on his steps owed his organization $80,000 she had never borrowed, a debt that wore another man's name. He didn't know yet that 3 miles south a 9-year-old boy, with a scar through his hairline, was waiting in a hospital bed for a surgery no one in that family could ever pay for. He only knew that she'd walked 10 miles through the snow to return a dog to a man. Most of this city prayed they'd never have to meet, and that when he finally asked her why she'd risk so much for an animal she could have left in an empty lot, she gave him an answer so quiet and so true that for the first time in longer than he could remember, Cormac Vale had nothing to say. If a story about dignity, about the price of being truly seen, and about a woman who wouldn't let herself be bought, is the kind of story you came here for, do us a favor and tap that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Now let's go back to that doorway, to the snow, and to the 10 miles that brought her there. The parking lot behind the Halcyon Casino was empty at 5:51 in the morning, the exact hour when the city was still asleep, and only people who had no choice were awake. Delia Faye Brennan stepped out through the side door with the bag holding her work shoes in her hand, 27 years old, having stood on her feet since 11 o'clock the night before. She had just finished mopping the 3rd floor, just emptied the last trash bins, and the cold struck her face the instant the door closed behind her. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, the coat that had grown thin through 2 winters, and she saw the dog before she saw the leash. It was sitting beside the dumpster at the far corner of the lot, not lying down but sitting upright, keeping its weight off its left front leg the way an old dog does when its joints have betrayed it. The fur around its neck was wet and matted. It was a golden retriever. It looked at her without surprise. She stopped walking. 3 things ran through her mind in the next few seconds. She noticed it was wearing a collar. She noticed it wasn't lost in the way a stray dog gets lost, but lost in the way somebody's animal gets lost. And she noticed that nobody was looking for it in that parking lot at 5:51 in the morning, in 9 degrees below zero. She crossed the lot. The dog did not move until she came close enough to touch it. Then it stood, put weight on the bad leg and flinched softly, then waited for her to decide. She knelt, took off her glove and turned over the tag on its collar. An address on Blackstone Boulevard, a phone number, and when she turned the tag over, there were 4 words engraved by hand, almost worn away, saying, "My name is Loved." She read it twice. She did not understand why her throat tightened. She pulled the phone from her coat pocket, pressed the button, and the screen showed the message that her account was empty, with no service left. Her plan had run out yesterday. She had known it would run out, had known since Thursday, when she had to choose between adding money to her phone and buying the medicine her little brother needed. She had chosen the medicine. She would choose it again. She did not call anyone, not because there was no one to call, but because asking someone to come get her was also a kind of accepting help, and she had sworn never to accept that again. 7 years earlier, when Owen was only 2 years old, he had his first sear at 3 o'clock in the morning, and she had no one to call, no car passing her street at that hour. She had wrapped him in a blanket, put him in the back seat, sat behind the wheel, and turned the key. The rest of that night only came back to her in pieces: the windshield wipers, a streetlight that had gone out, and the way she kept glancing at the rearview mirror, at every red light, to see whether he was still breathing. Then, at an intersection, she did not see the light in time. Another car crossed through on its green, and Owen's forehead struck the metal frame of the seat. 14 stitches, a thin scar running from the tail of his eyebrow up to his hairline, which the doctor said would fade but never fully disappear. He did not die. But from that night on, Delia never drove again. She made herself a rule and called it the walking rule. Under 4 miles, she walked. Even in an emergency, she walked. Because she had learned that panic wasn't an emotion, but a decision the body made on its own, when the mind stopped choosing, and she would never again let her body choose speed. She had walked through everything since then, through the funeral of her parents, who had died in a fire people called an accident, through the day Travis Hale, the man who had once been her husband and the father on paper of no one, vanished from this city, leaving behind nothing but debts she had never borrowed. She took Owen's old shoelace from her pocket, the lace she still kept for reasons she never said aloud, threaded it through the dog's collar, tied it 3 times, and tested it to be sure. It held. The bus stop was 1/4 mile in one direction. The address on the tag was 10 miles in the opposite direction. Across streets no bus would reach that morning. The dog looked at her. She looked back at it, then looked north, toward Blackstone Boulevard, where people like her were never invited in. The snow had begun falling harder. She turned her back on the bus stop, and she started walking. At that same hour, 10 miles north, inside the house on Blackstone Boulevard, Cormac Vale had woken at 5:12 in the morning and gone down to the kitchen to find the back door open. Not broken, not forced, just open. The kind of open that happens when someone pulls a door shut but does not fully latch it, and the wind does the rest. He stood in the doorway for a while. The cold poured through the kitchen. He looked down at the floor, at the empty space beside the kitchen island, where the dog bed had been for 9 years, and where it still was. He walked to the bed. The blanket was folded. He touched it. It was cold. He went outside, stood on the back porch in his slippers, and called the dog's name once. He did not call loudly. He did not call a second time. Then he went back inside, closed the door, and sat down at the kitchen table. He did not call anyone. He did not call Bishop Halloran, the man who had looked after everything for him for 22 years, and would have been there within half an hour if Cormac had only picked up the phone. He called no one at all. He sat still at the kitchen table for 22 minutes, and in those 22 minutes he did not check his phone, did not get up to make coffee, did not turn on the kitchen light. He looked at the empty water bowl on the floor beside the refrigerator, the bowl that had been filled every morning since the dog was still a puppy, and he understood something he had refused to understand for the past 16 months. Shep had been Maeve's dog. Maeve was his sister, and Maeve had died of a blood disease at 33, on a November morning when the hospital had called him, before the sky was fully light. The dog leaving did not feel like a dog running away. For 16 months, Cormac had not changed a single thing in the house. Maeve's books were still on the shelves. Her coat still hung by the side door. The dog still slept on the pillow on the side of the bed that had once been hers. This morning, for the first time in 16 months, something that belonged to her had left this house, and he sat there realizing he did not know whether he was allowed to want it back, because wanting something back also meant admitting he had let it go. Maeve was the only person who had ever seen some part of him that he had stopped believing existed. In her final years, she had never stopped trying to pull him out of the world he ran, and she had done it with a patience he had never seen in anyone else toward him. On the tabletop, about a handspan from his own hand, lay a small leather-bound notebook. It was Maeve's notebook. He had found it in the drawer of her desk 11 days after the funeral, and in 16 months he had opened it only once. He had read the first few pages, the pages where she wrote about the people she had quietly helped with her own money, families being strangled by the very thing her brother had built, and he had reached one place and stopped. He did not turn another page. He had set the notebook down and had not dared touch the pages that followed, because he knew Maeve had written about him in there, and he was not ready to hear her say what she had wanted to say when she was no longer here to say it. The notebook had been lying on this table ever since. He looked at it now in the gray morning light, and for the first time he allowed himself to think of something he had been thinking about more and more in recent months. That perhaps it was time to hand everything over, that perhaps there was a way to step out of this world without having to lie down inside it, that perhaps this was exactly what Maeve had been trying to tell him for all of her life. He did not allow the thought to go any further. In his world, a man who let that thought grow was a man who had signed his own sentence, and he knew that better than anyone. He placed one hand on the table beside the notebook, but did not pick it up. He sat in the silence he had carried through this house for 16 months. And just then, the doorbell rang. He stood and went to the door, and when he opened it, the woman was standing there on the front steps with the dog beside her left knee. And in that first moment, what caught his attention was not her, but the dog. Shep did not rush toward him. That was the first thing. The dog stood still beside her knee, keeping its weight off the injured leg, and looked up at him the way a dog looks at someone it knows but is not yet ready to be returned to. 4 seconds passed. Then it took one step forward, leaned its head into his hand, and stepped back beside her knee. She did not understand what she had just witnessed. Neither did he. For 9 years he had watched this dog run to Maeve every time she came through the door, and now it leaned its head against his hand for 1 second, as if to say it knew him, then went back to the woman who had brought it here, as though it had not yet decided where it belonged. He looked at her. He looked at the coat, the hands, the lace tied through the dog's collar, the bag with the work shoes inside. He was a man who had built an entire fortune on his ability to read a situation in less than 30 seconds, and he had finished reading this one before she could even complete a sentence. He asked where she had found it. She said in the parking lot behind the Halcyon Casino. He said that was 10 miles. She said she knew. There was a silence. He did not ask her name. He offered to drive her home, and she said she would walk, and he said it was still snowing, and she said she knew. He did not press her. He said nothing about her shoes being soaked through. He said nothing about the temperature still not having risen above 0 degrees. He said nothing about the 10 miles she had just walked, or the 10 miles she was about to walk back. He bent down, untied the shoelace from the dog's collar, and handed it back to her without a word. She put it in her pocket. She thanked him for something she did not clearly name, then added that it had been lying on the ground. That was all, as if that were the whole reason, and nothing more needed to be said. She did not say she had walked 10 miles through snow in 9 degrees below 0 for a stranger's dog. She did not say her phone had run out of money. She did not say she had a little brother lying in a hospital bed 3 miles south, who would not be discharged until someone in some office approved a bill she could not possibly pay. She said none of that. She turned away. She walked down the 4 stone steps. She crossed the gravel drive in a straight line, the kind of straight line a person walks when they have already decided where their feet are going, and have no intention of letting anything change it. The dog watched her from the threshold. It did not whine. It did not pull toward his hand. It only watched. Cormac did not close the door. He stood there until she reached the gate. He stood there until she turned south on the public road. He stood there until the snow still falling between the rows of trees took away the shape of her shoulders and gave it back to the morning as something blurred and walking. He did not know her name yet. He did not know where she was going. He only knew that he had once seen someone walk like that before, and that knowledge placed a cold hand on the back of his neck that he could not name. He stood in the open doorway with the dog at his feet for a long while after she had disappeared, and then he heard a car coming up the drive slowly, and he knew the sound of that engine before he saw the car. Bishop Halloran stopped in front of the steps, got out, and stood looking at the dog with the expression of a 67-year-old man who had long ago stopped being surprised by anything. He looked at Shep, then at Cormac, then toward the gate where a figure had just vanished into the snow, and he asked who had just left. Cormac said he did not know, and that was the truth. He did not know her name, did not know where she had come from, only that she had brought the dog back and refused to be driven home. Bishop Halloran came into the house, set his old leather briefcase on the kitchen table beside Maeve's notebook, which he never asked about, and said he had seen her on the drive up here. A woman walking south through the snow, and that there was something about her that had made him look twice. Cormac told him to find out who she was. It was not an unusual request in their world. Knowing the name of someone who had stood on his doorstep was a habit as old as Cormac himself, and Bishop Halloran, whom Cormac often called Book, had done far harder things than that in 22 years. He made a few calls, described the woman, described the dog, described the hour in the parking lot behind the Halcyon Casino, and in less than 40 minutes he had a name. Delia Faye Brennan, 27 years old, working the night shift as a janitor for the cleaning contractor at the Halcyon Casino, an establishment Cormac's organization, controlled through 3 layers of companies registered under other names. He placed the paper on the table. Then he continued, more slowly, saying he had looked one step further because the name felt familiar, and that second step was what made the kitchen fall silent. Delia Brennan had once had a husband named Travis Hale. They had divorced, and she had kept her maiden name, which was why the name Brennan had not matched anything in the records. Why Cormac had looked at her for several minutes on his threshold and read everything about her in 30 seconds without reading this, because in the organization's books there was no woman named Delia Brennan, only a man named Travis Hale, and beside that name was a number, $80,000, a gambling debt accumulated over 2 years, rolled from one casino to another, until it landed in the books of the Vale organization. And then the man carrying that name had vanished from Providence without paying a single cent, leaving the debt sitting there like something still alive. Book did not say the thing they both understood. In this world, a debt did not disappear just because the borrower disappeared. It stayed with the name, and when the name was no longer there to collect from, it stayed with those who had shared the same roof, the same road, the same thread of blood. The woman who had walked 10 miles through the snow to return his dog was his debtor, and she did not know it, and until this morning, neither had he. She had stood on the doorstep of the man who held in his hands the power to tighten around her, the power to threaten her, the power to do to her the things his organization still did to names that refused to pay, and she had done it only because a dog had been lying on the ground. Cormac stood still for a very long time. Book asked how he wanted the Hale debt handled, because that was the question he had always had to ask for 22 years, and the answer had always been cold and clear. This time Cormac did not answer right away, and it was in that silence that Book added one more thing, something he had weighed whether to say or not, that Royce Calder had been asking about the list of outstanding debts in the Halcyon area since last week, that Royce was becoming increasingly interested in numbers that were not supposed to be his business, and that a man like Royce did not ask about something unless he had already decided to do something with it. Cormac knew Royce Calder. He was one of the men beneath him, younger, hungrier, a man who had waited a long time for the moment when the man at the top showed even a single flicker of hesitation. Cormac looked at the name Delia Faye Brennan on the paper, then at his sister's leather-bound notebook lying a handspan away, and he told Book not to do anything with the Hale debt until he said so, and not to let Royce Calder touch it. Book nodded once and did not ask why. After Halloran left, Cormac stood by the kitchen window looking out toward the road where she had disappeared, and he could not name the thing pulling him out of the house. It was not the debt, it was the way she walked. He had seen it at the threshold and had not allowed himself to look straight at it, but now, standing alone in the silent kitchen, he let it come back, and he knew exactly where he had seen it before. In the final 3 months of her life, Maeve had walked to every one of her treatments at the hospital, 1.8 miles from the house, across the bridge, into the medical center on Center Street. She had carried her own bag. She had refused the car. She had refused him. He had asked her once why, and she had said that if she let people drive her there, then she was letting it take possession of her. He had not understood her then. He had thought it was stubbornness, a control mechanism, something they would talk through later. They never talked it through. She ran out of time, And now, 16 months later, he stood in the doorway of a house she no longer lived in, watching another woman walk through snow in 9 degrees below zero, with that same rhythm, the same forward slope of the shoulders, the same refusal to look back. And he understood Maeve now in a way he had not been able to understand while she was still here. He picked up the car keys from the bowl on the table beside the door. He did not call Book. He did not call anyone. He put on his coat, went out through the garage, started the engine, and drove through the gate. He found her at the end of the second block on the public road running south toward the city. He lowered his headlights to the dim setting. He kept the car at exactly the speed she was walking. He did not intend to stop her. He did not intend to offer again. He only wanted to see where her walking ended. He carried a map of Providence in his head after 20 years, in the business of buying and selling pieces of this city's land, and he knew every shortcut between Blackstone Boulevard and downtown. He knew the fastest road south for a woman walking through snow. She did not take that road. At the bottom of the slope, where the road met a three-way junction, and anyone heading back toward the Halcyon district would have turned right, she did not turn right. She turned left. Left was the wrong direction for the casino. Left led toward the hospital district, toward the medical complex stretching along Eddy Street and Dudley Street, the place anyone who had ever lived in this city connected with the worst day in the life of someone they loved. He did not understand that turn at first. He understood it 5 seconds later. She was not going home. She was going somewhere specific. He let her keep the lead. He kept the car at the slowest speed the speedometer would still register, and he stayed about 70 yards behind her, and he did not close the distance. The snow was falling harder now. She did not cover her head. He saw her dark hair beginning to whiten along the part. She did not pull up her collar. She did not tuck her hands inside her coat. She walked exactly the way she had walked when she left his house, and the snow did not change that. She did not move faster. She did not slow down. Inside the car, he did not turn on the radio, and he did not turn the heater above the lowest setting, because if the windshield fogged, he would lose sight of her. He drove, and he thought about Maeve, about a March morning 11 months earlier, when he had stood at the window of the house and watched her cross the bridge on her own 2 feet, dragging the small bag of things she carried to treatment. She had crossed that bridge in weather just like this. She had not looked back either. He had not followed her then. He had not understood that following might have been allowed. He understood it now, in a way he did not think any words could carry. Ahead of him, the woman crossed one final intersection, and when she stepped onto the sidewalk on the other side, Cormac saw the building she was walking toward, the building with the words on its front that he had known for a long time, the city's children's hospital, and he understood that the person she was going to see was not an adult. At the corner where Eddy Street met a small road leading into the hospital district, a black sport utility vehicle had been waiting at the red light, then turned right without fully stopping. The vehicle did not see her. She was at the edge of the sidewalk, about to step onto the crosswalk. Cormac hit the horn once, hard. The other driver slammed the brakes. Delia stopped. She did not jump back. She did not startle. She simply stopped, and the vehicle slid past the place where she would have been standing by about 2 feet, corrected its course, then continued turning, and vanished into the street. In that moment, Cormac saw enough to know whose vehicle it was, and that knowledge chilled him more than the near collision itself, because he recognized it as one of the cars Royce Calder's people used, and a car like that appearing in this district at this hour meant Royce had someone watching him, or watching something he had not yet understood. But that was the thought of the second after. In the first second, all he saw was her standing there, whole, in the place where she might not have stayed whole. She turned her head toward the sound of the horn. She saw his car. For an instant she did not recognize what she was looking at. Then she did. The dark windshield, the man inside, the man whose dog she had placed into his hands about 90 minutes earlier. She looked at him for less than 2 seconds. She did not wave. She did not nod. She did not signal anything that could be understood as gratitude or caution or surprise. She did not change her expression. She did not change the shape of her body. She turned her face forward. She kept walking. She had known about the car since the 3rd block. She did not look back, did not slow down, did not allow herself to think about the man inside it beyond treating him as a fact at the edge of things, the way a person does not think about the weather while walking through it, but still feels every degree of it on their skin. She had heard the gate close behind her. She had heard a garage door open about 70 yards away. She had heard the smooth, deliberate sound of a car engine that was in no hurry. A car moving at the exact rhythm of her steps was a car paying attention to her steps. She knew what it was. She also knew what it was not. The man behind the wheel had let her hold his dog at his own front door without demanding anything, not even a name. And a man who did not demand a name at his own door was not the kind of man who would demand it from behind a windshield in a snowstorm. Her body was tired and cold. In that second, her body wanted to walk to that car, open the passenger door, sit down, and let somebody else decide the rest of this day for her. Her mind did not let her body do that, because her mind knew one thing her body kept forgetting. Help given to someone on the edge of falling was not help. It was permission to collapse. She did not need permission to collapse. She needed her little brother to live until his 10th birthday. She turned her face forward and kept walking. She crossed the street at the crosswalk in front of the children's hospital. His car stopped at the curb on the other side. He did not get out. He turned off the engine, placed both hands on the steering wheel, and sat still where he was. She stepped through the revolving door into the lobby. The snow on her coat began to melt the instant she crossed the threshold, her shoulders darkening, the hem dripping, a small puddle gathering around her shoes. The woman at the reception desk looked up. She had been on duty there for most of the past 9 days. She knew Delia in the way a doorkeeper of a building knows the people who have lived there a long time, without speaking, without display, without verification. She nodded. Delia nodded back. Then she walked toward the elevators, leaving the man in the car sitting at the curb across the street with both hands on the steering wheel, and a question he still had no way to answer. The hospital room was on the 6th floor, a small room painted pale blue with one window facing east, and Owen Brennan was sitting propped against 2 pillows when his sister came in. The boy was 9 years old. On his forehead, running from the tail of his right eyebrow up to his hairline, was the thin scar she knew better than anything on her own face, the scar that had been there for 7 years and would remain there for the rest of his life, fading as the doctor had promised, but never disappearing completely. He had a form of epilepsy that ordinary medications could not control, the kind the doctors called, by a word she had memorized long ago, refractory, meaning his body did not respond to the treatments that still worked for other children, meaning they had tried one medicine after another for 5 years, meaning his doctors were now talking about surgery, a procedure that would reach into the very area of the brain where the seizures began, a procedure that might give him what medicine had never been able to give, days that were not lived in fear of waiting for the next thing. It was the best hope he had. It was also something this family could not afford. This hospital stay was his 4th this year. He had been here for 9 days. When she walked in, his whole face changed and he said, "You came." She said, "I always come." She crossed the room in 3 steps and sat on the edge of the bed, kissed the top of his head, and the nurse who had been caring for him for 9 days came in 2 minutes later with the cart for the morning vitals, not greeting her, only doing her work, because that was the way Delia preferred it. Delia took her brother's small hand. He asked if she had to go to work again today, and she said yes, tonight, but for now she was here. He asked how she had gotten here, and she said she had walked, as she always walked, and he nodded, because he had grown up inside that rhythm of walking the way some children grow up inside a faith, with no need for anyone to explain it, only for it to remain consistent, and it had always remained consistent. He did not know that this morning she had walked much farther than usual. He did not know about the dog, about the tag, about the man in the car sitting across the street at that very moment. She did not tell him any of it. She only sat with him, counting his breaths, out of old habit, and let him tell her about the freight trains. He still counted from the bridge, near their home whenever he was well enough to walk there. On the table beside the bed lay a sheet of paper she had read 11 times that morning. The total bill for this hospital stay, after public insurance had paid its part, still left a number, $23,600 and a little change, and that was only this stay, not the surgery. The surgery was another number, a number so large she had stopped trying to imagine it as something she could reach. In her account, she had $403. She did the math out of habit, not because she still expected it to produce a different result, but because doing the math was the only way she knew to keep herself steady, to face the number instead of letting it face her from the dark. She thought of her parents, gone in a fire people had called an accident, and she thought that if they were still alive, perhaps she would have someone to call. Then she pushed the thought away, because it could not help with the number on the paper. The nurse finished writing down the vitals, hung the note on the clip at the foot of the bed, and before she left, she stopped by the door, looked at Delia, and said the financial office downstairs had called up. They wanted to see her. Delia stood. She squeezed Owen's hand and told him she would be right back. He nodded the way he nodded at everything she said. She stepped into the hallway and headed toward the stairs, because the elevator would give her too much time to think. Cormac sat in the car with the engine off and snow slowly gathering on the windshield, and he did not move for 9 minutes. Then he picked up his phone and called Bishop Halloran. He said he needed Book to call the billing department at the children's hospital. Book was silent for 2 seconds, then asked what he was looking for. Cormac said he needed a list of every unpaid pediatric admission in the past 2 weeks under the name of a boy named Owen, under 10 years old, with a remaining balance after public insurance had paid its part. 20 minutes later, Book called back. He had 3 files. 3 boys, 3 admissions to the 6th floor of the children's hospital in the past 14 days, all under 10 years old, all with unpaid balances. Cormac did not ask which boy had a sister who walked through snow in 9 degrees below zero. He said to pay all 3. Book paused. All three. Wire the money. Personal account, not organization account. Don't let it run through anything with the Vale name on it. Private funds. No tax deduction. Anonymous donor. The hospital is not allowed to disclose the source under any circumstances. Absolute confidentiality. The mothers, the sisters, none of them gets a name. Not now. Not ever unless I say otherwise. And one more thing, he said. Whichever boy in those 3 files is waiting on surgery funding, take care of that too, the same way. Book asked what the total would be, and Cormac said he did not care about the number, only that it be settled before closing time today. He paid all 3 because paying only hers would point straight at her, and a man like him knew the only way to hide one good deed was to bury it between 2 other good deeds so no one could trace it back to a single name. He ended the call. He set the phone on the seat beside him. He looked at the hospital entrance across the street. She did not come out. He had known she would not come out. A woman who had walked 10 miles through the snow to return a stranger's dog would not leave her brother's hospital bed before discharge time. He started the car, turned on the wipers, and drove away. At that same moment, on the 2nd floor of the hospital, Delia sat down in the chair before the desk of a woman in the financial office, a room lit far too brightly for the things people came there to hear. The woman behind the desk opened a file, looked up, and gave the small professional smile of someone accustomed to delivering both kinds of news. She said the bill had been paid in full. Delia said nothing. The woman added that the cost of the upcoming surgery had also been taken care of. Delia asked by whom. The woman looked down at the file, then back at her. Anonymous donor. Anonymous from where? That is all I am allowed to tell you. Delia looked at the file. She looked at the woman's face. She looked at the small raised hospital seal on the letterhead. She did not cry. She did not say thank you. She did not ask the question a second time. She stood and walked out. She took the stairs back up to the 6th floor, because the elevator would give her time to think. And she did not want to think in the way Relief wanted her to think, did not want to let herself believe in something just because it was good, because Delia did not believe in luck. Delia believed in receipts. A number of $23,000 did not disappear on its own, and a surgery so large she had stopped daring to imagine it did not simply get carried by someone without a reason. And in her experience, things with no visible reason were always things with a reason hidden underneath. Someone had paid. Someone had ordered that the payment be hidden. And she knew, in the way she knew most important things, that generosity hidden that carefully was not a gift being given, but a string, and one day someone would pull the other end of it. She returned to room 612, sat down beside her brother, and did not tell him that someone whose name she was not allowed to know had just changed the entire calculation she had been carrying for 5 years. Royce Calder knew about the transfer before sunset that day, because in this world money never moved without leaving a ripple, and Royce had spent years learning how to read ripples. He was 34, younger than Cormac, and he had stood beneath Cormac long enough to know the exact shape of every decision the man at the top made, knew that Cormac Vale never spent a single dollar without a cold and calculable reason behind it. An $80,000 debt under the name Travis Hale, a name long dead in the books, was suddenly erased. 3 children's hospital bills were paid with personal money, hidden behind a curtain of confidentiality that even Royce had to work to lift by one corner. There was no profit, no leverage had been created, no name had been forced to feel indebted, in the way the organization usually forced people to feel indebted. To Royce, that meant only one thing: the man at the top had gone soft. And a man at the top going soft in this world was not a person changing. It was an opening taking shape, an opening a younger and hungrier man had the right to step into. He had been waiting for this moment longer than he wanted to admit even to himself. He had watched Cormac change in small ways most people did not notice over the past 16 months, ever since the day his sister died, and he had been waiting for the first sign that grief had eaten its way into that man's decision-making. Today's transfer was that sign. But there was something else driving Royce too, something he told no one, something buried deeper than his hunger for power. He was afraid of Maeve Vale. Or rather, he was afraid of what Maeve had once known. In the final years of her life, that woman had begun looking too closely into things that should not have concerned her, had begun tracing old matters, things from the time when Royce was still a young enforcer, willing to do anything to climb higher, things that, if told in the right way, would bury him deeper than any enemy had ever tried to bury him. He knew Maeve had gathered something. He did not know how far she had gotten, but when she died, he had allowed himself to believe that whatever she had collected had died with her, had vanished into the belongings of a dead woman no one would ever bother searching through. For 16 months, he had slept peacefully with that belief. And it was that very belief, the comfort of thinking the past had been buried with the only person who had ever dug it up, that made Royce dare to act now. Because if the evidence was gone, then the only person still standing between him and the summit was Cormac Vale. And Cormac Vale had just shown the whole underworld that he had begun paying for the care of strange children instead of tightening his hands around debtors' throats. Royce began doing the things a man like him does when he smells a throne starting to wobble. He met with the men in the middle ranks of the organization, men loyal out of fear rather than faith, and he planted in their ears the thought that the man at the top was no longer the man they had once followed. He had people look again through the list of debts in the Halcyon district, the very list Bishop Halloran had already warned Cormac about, and carefully, quietly, he began searching to see whether anything belonging to Maeve Vale might still remain somewhere. Not because he believed it did, but because a man who had survived as long as Royce never stepped toward a throne, without first checking whether there was a knife lying behind his back. He did not know that the leather-bound notebook was lying on a kitchen table on Blackstone Boulevard, opened to its first pages and closed before the pages that followed, waiting for a hand brave enough to turn them. He only knew that the man at the top had hesitated once, and in their world, once was enough. Owen was discharged 3 days later, and in the weeks that followed, Delia did not forget. She began asking. She went back to the financial office, and the woman there this time was a different woman with the same answer. Anonymous donor, we are not allowed. She went to the patient assistance office. They were not allowed. She went to the hospital administration office on the 3rd floor, and a woman with a polite voice said the funding had been made under the donor's absolute confidentiality, that disclosure would violate the agreement, and asked whether she was sure she wanted to pursue this through official channels. Delia said she was not sure she wanted to pursue anything through any channel. She only wanted to know. The woman with the polite face said she was very sorry. Every door Delia knocked on opened onto the same wall, and it was a kind of wall she had learned to recognize. The kind built not because people did not know, but because they had been told not to know. Confidentiality that tight required money and power, and both of those things pointed in one direction she had not yet dared to name. At last, on a weekend morning, she went to the office of the hospital chaplain on the 5th floor. Father Aloysius Quill sat behind his desk. He was 61 years old, had worked as an electrician for 30 years before becoming a chaplain, and he had the posture of a man who had spent his life around things that hummed, ached, and occasionally needed to be watched closely. In front of him sat a cup of coffee gone cold in the way coffee in Chaplin's offices always goes cold. She sat down in the chair across from him. She did not ask the question. She still had not found a way to form it. He looked at her over the rim of his glasses. He did not ask why she had come. He said, "Did you return the dog?" The room went still. She did not answer him. She sat there with his question hanging in the air between them, and she felt something cold slide down her spine. Because this chaplain knew about the dog. This chaplain was not someone who would know about a dog unless someone had told him, and the person who had told him was not her. She had never said a word about the dog to a living soul, not to Owen, not to the nurse, not to the woman at the reception desk. Only one other person in this world knew about the dog, about the 10-mile road, about the tag and the 4 words engraved on its back. And if this chaplain knew, then this chaplain knew that person. The dog's owner, the man on Blackstone Boulevard, the man in the car that had moved at the rhythm of her steps for 10 miles and had sat across the street when she walked into the hospital. The man she did not know was her own creditor, though she still did not know that. She only knew that the person who had paid her brother's hospital bills and the person whose dog she had returned were the same person, and that he had built an entire wall of confidentiality so she would never be able to reach his name. Generosity hidden that carefully was not a gift. It was a person standing in the dark and watching, and Delia could not live with owing a shadow. She stood. She thanked the chaplain for his time. She walked out of his office, down the stairs, through the lobby, and out the hospital doors. She did not stop until she had left the hospital block behind, and even then she did not stop, because her feet had already made the decision for her, as they always did. She did not get on a bus. She did not make a call. She turned her face north, toward Blackstone Boulevard, toward the gate people like her were never invited through, and for the second time in her life, she began walking toward that man's house, this time not to return anything, but to demand back something she could not yet name. The gate on Blackstone Boulevard was open when she arrived, and she walked up the drive, climbed the 4 stone steps, and rang the bell. He opened the door himself. He preferred to answer his own door, a habit born of a lifetime of caution, and had no intention of stopping now. She did not greet him. She said, "You paid my brother's hospital bills." He did not deny it. She said, "You hid it behind 3 walls so I would never find you." He said, "I cleared the debts for 3 families. I did not know which child was your brother." She looked at him. She did not thank him. She asked why. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, and then he said, "Because of my sister." It was the first time she had heard that word from him, and he did not explain further, and she did not ask him to explain. She nodded once, but she did not turn away. He looked at her standing on the threshold of his house. The woman he now knew was his own debtor, even though she still did not know it, and he did something he had not done with anyone in 16 months. He invited her in. She did not take off her coat. She sat down at the long oak table in the way she always sat in places that did not belong to her, shoulders leaning forward, elbows tucked close to her body, both hands folded in her lap. He went up to the study on the 2nd floor and came back down with the leather-bound notebook. He placed it on the table between them. He did not say what it was. He said it was his sister's notebook, that her name had been Maeve, that she had died 16 months earlier, and that in the final years of her life, she had used her own money to quietly help families being strangled by the very thing her brother had built. He said he had found the notebook 11 days after the funeral, and that he had opened it only once, read a few of the first pages, and stopped. She asked why he had stopped. He said because he knew his sister had written about him in there, and he had never been ready to hear what she wanted to say when she was no longer here to say it. She looked at the notebook. She said, "Then you never read all of it." He said he had not. And then, for a reason neither of them could name, he opened the notebook, turned past the first pages he knew by heart, the lines about a mother sleeping in a chair beside her child's bed, because the chair was closer to the child than the folding cot they had brought, about a grandmother singing to her grandson when the boy's oxygen level dropped, and then he reached the place where he had stopped 16 months earlier, and this time he did not stop. She leaned forward. They read together. The pages that followed were no longer like the pages before. Maeve no longer wrote about the people she helped. She began writing about a name, about old things, things belonging to a time she did not directly name, but described clearly enough that anyone who knew that world would understand. She wrote about money being moved to places it should not have gone. She wrote about names disappearing from the books and people disappearing from the city. She wrote about a man standing beneath her brother, a younger man who had climbed by doing things she was now retracing step by step. And she wrote that she was gathering, that she was piecing it together, that she wanted to put it in her brother's hands, once it was complete enough that he could not look away. She did not write his full name on every page, but on one page she wrote enough, and Cormac read that name, and the whole room seemed to freeze. Royce Calder. She did not know who that name belonged to. He did. He knew that his dead sister had spent the final months of her life not only helping strange children, but quietly building something that could bury the very man who, according to Book's warning, was even now sniffing through the organization and catching the scent of a throne beginning to wobble. He sat very still with the notebook open before him, and for the first time he understood why he had not dared read further for 16 months, not because he was afraid of what Maeve thought of him, but because some part of him had always known that his sister never left a story unfinished, and that if she had written something this far, she had meant for it to go farther still, and that her death perhaps had not given her time. He closed the notebook before that name, not because he wanted to hide it from her, but because there was something else he needed to ask first, something that had been inside him since the morning she had stood on his threshold and refused to be driven home. He looked at her and asked the question he had not asked that morning. He asked why she had done it, why she had walked 10 miles through snow in 9 degrees below zero to bring a dog back to a stranger, a man half the city prayed they would never have to meet, when she could have left it in that empty parking lot and no one in this world could have blamed her. She did not answer right away. She looked down at her hands folded in her lap, then said it was because of the tag on its collar. He said he did not understand. She said someone took the trouble to engrave the back of that tag, not the address, not the phone number. The front already had all of that. Someone turned the tag over and carved 4 more words on the back by hand, pressing hard enough that 16 months and however many winters had not worn them away. Saying that my name is loved, she said. I don't know who carved it. I don't know whether that person is alive or dead, but I know that for someone to sit down and carve those 4 words onto the back of a tag, that animal had to be the last thing left of something to somebody. She said, I know what it feels like to be the only thing someone still remembers with love after the whole world has decided you aren't worth remembering. I know what it feels like to walk past a place every day and know that no one inside is looking for you. And I couldn't leave a living creature loved that deeply lying dead on the ground in the snow. Even when I had nothing left to give it. Even when it wasn't mine. Even when it was yours. She said that last sentence without knowing how deeply true it was. Without knowing that the dog really was his in the heaviest sense of the word. The last thing in this house that had ever heard Maeve laugh. And Cormac. The man who had not flinched before things that made other people fall to their knees. The man who had sat across from threats and gun barrels, without a single muscle in his face changing, sat there and could not find one word to say. Because that was exactly what Maeve had tried to teach him all her life, that a person's value did not come from what others could take from them. That dignity was not what remained when you had lost everything, but what you chose to keep when accepting help meant losing yourself. She had said that to him in every possible way through all those years, and he had heard it the way people hear a language they do not intend to learn, until this morning, when a strange woman walked 10 miles through snow and said it back to him in the very language Maeve had never been able to find. He opened the notebook again, not to the name Royce Calder, but to the last page where Maeve's handwriting appeared, the page he had never read until today. There, in the small script of a hand tired from illness, she had written, "There is a woman who walks past the clinic every morning. She has a little brother about 9 years old. The boy is sick. She never comes in. She always walks past. I want to find out her name." The sentence stopped there. Maeve had not written anything more that night. She read it. She read it a second time. She said, "I walked past that clinic every morning on my way to work, for years, because I did not have insurance to step inside. I did not know there was a woman watching me from within." He handed her the pen. She did not ask permission. She said her name aloud first, Delia Faye Brennan, then placed the tip of the pen on the paper, in the empty space after the unfinished period, and in her own handwriting, She wrote her name into the place Maeve had left blank for 16 months, waiting for someone to fill it in. Royce Calder did not need to find the notebook in order to act. He only needed to find the weakness, and he found it in the very good deed Cormac had tried to hide. His people traced back the 3 hospital bills paid with personal money, and although the wall of confidentiality protected the name of the person who had paid, it did not protect the names of those who had been paid for. Royce read those 3 names, and when he saw a boy named Owen Brennan, with a sister named Delia Brennan, and when he discovered that Delia Brennan had once been married to a debtor named Travis Hale, he understood immediately what he was holding in his hands. The man at the top had not paid for a strange child. The man at the top had paid for something he cared about, and something the man at the top cared about was something that could be used to break him. Royce did not touch the child. He did not need to do anything that crude and dangerous, and he was smart enough to know that in this modern world, there were ways to choke a family tighter than any hand. Owen's surgery had been scheduled based on funding that Royce now knew where to question. He had his lawyers send the hospital a series of inquiries about the legality of the money's source, suggesting that the funding might be connected to money of questionable origin, enough to frighten the hospital's legal department into freezing the payment until everything could be clarified. One phone call, one letter on the letterhead of a law office, and the surgery that had once been a boy's best hope was suddenly suspended in a legal emptiness that might take months to unravel, if it could be unraveled at all. That was Royce's way. There were no fingerprints on it. There was nothing pointing straight at him. There was only a family being pushed once again to the edge of something they could not afford. And then he played his second piece. Travis Hale had never gone as far beyond the organization's reach as everyone believed. A debtor who vanished was not always a free debtor. Sometimes he was only a debtor someone had stored away for the proper moment. Royce had found Travis months earlier and kept him somewhere, a pawn waiting on the board, and now he brought that pawn out. Travis was brought back to Providence with a promise that his $80,000 debt would be erased, and that he himself would be left alone. In exchange for one thing. He only had to testify, stand up and say that Cormac Vale had used the organization's money to buy off a family, that the man at the top had betrayed the rules on which this world itself had been built. In the underworld, a leader who paid for a debtor instead of squeezing the debt was a man who had broken the order, and Royce intended to use Travis's own testimony to turn Cormac's compassion into betrayal before the middle-ranked men he had been whispering to for weeks. Travis Hale, the man who had abandoned Delia and Owen, the man who had left behind a debt she had never borrowed, had now returned to sell out the very man who had silently saved the son he had turned his back on, and he did it for the same reason he had always done everything, because he was afraid, because he owed, because he was the kind of man who always chose the road that saved himself. Cormac learned of both moves before the day was over, because Bishop Halloran had ears in places even Royce did not expect, and he sat in his sister's study, with the notebook on the table, and the name Royce Calder still open on the page, and he stood before 2 roads, one of which he had walked for his entire life. The first was the road he knew well, the road of the world that had made him, where one threat was answered with a greater threat, where a man like Royce disappeared in the way names had always disappeared from his books, quickly, coldly, and without leaving questions behind. The second was the road Maeve had tried to show him all her life, the road he had never taken, the road that would not allow him to become the very thing she had written about in those pages. On one side was saving the child by returning to the man the whole city feared. On the other was keeping the quiet promise he had only just begun to make to himself, and risking that the promise would not be fast enough to save a 9-year-old boy. News that the payment for the surgery had been frozen reached Delia through a call from the hospital the following afternoon. A polite voice explaining that there were a number of legal questions that needed to be clarified before anything could proceed, and that she should not worry. These things sometimes took a few months. A few months. She set the phone down and stood very still in her small kitchen for a long time, and she understood that someone had just reached in and pulled away the only thing standing between her brother and the years of no longer living in fear. She did not know all the pieces on the board, but she knew enough. She knew that the man who had silently paid the money was now having something turned against him. and that something had found Owen, and that somewhere inside the network she could not see, there was a name she had never thought she would hear again. Because in that same vague call, there had been a question about a man named Travis Hale, and that name dropped through her like a stone falling into a well. She could have called Cormac. She could have stayed still and let that powerful man handle everything in his own way. Let him decide the rest of this story for her, the way he had decided the hospital bill for her. She did not do that, because all her life, every time she had let someone else take the wheel for her, she had lost something she could never get back. She found out where they were holding Travis, through the very network she had lived inside for years. The janitors, the night guards, the invisible people who saw everything in this city without anyone noticing they were watching. And she went there on her own feet, telling no one. The room behind a warehouse on the south side of the city, where Royce had arranged for Travis to rehearse his testimony before it was presented, was not a place for a woman to walk into with nothing in her hands except the truth. When she stepped inside, Royce Calder looked at her with the expression of a man watching a piece move itself onto the wrong square, almost amused, almost pitying. He asked what she was doing there. She did not answer him. She looked past him toward the man sitting in the corner, the man she had not seen in 5 years, the man whose face she had once loved and then learned how to stop loving. Travis did not dare look at her. She did not scream. She did not accuse him. She only said the name of their son, Owen, and she said the boy was 9 years old now, that he had a scar on his forehead from the night she had almost lost him, that now there was a surgery that could give him a life, and that what Travis was about to do would take that life away from his own son just so he could save himself again. She said it in the even voice of someone who had stopped expecting anything from this man, and that very lack of expectation was what reached him in the place where pleading never could have reached. Royce told her to be quiet. He told Travis not to listen, that the deal was still the deal, that his debt would be erased and he would be free. And for one long moment, so tense, the whole room seemed to hold its breath. Travis Hale sat between two roads in exactly the way Cormac had sat between two roads the night before, one leading toward saving himself, by doing the very thing he had always done, the other leading toward doing, for the first time in his life, something right even if it cost him. He looked at the woman he had abandoned. He looked down at the testimony in his hand, and he set it down. He said no. He said he would not testify, that none of the lies in it were true, and that no matter how terrible a man he was, he would not sell out his own son. Royce's anger erupted through the room like pressure, and in the next few seconds, everything became very tense and very dangerous, a struggle of wills and bodies in a space far too small. But Delia did not step back, and Travis moved forward to stand between her and Royce. And at that exact moment, from the doorway behind them, a deep and calm voice rose, and Cormac Vale stepped into the room. Cormac had not come alone. Bishop Halloran stepped in behind him, and behind Book came 2 of the men from the middle ranks of the organization whom Royce had been whispering to for weeks, the very men he had intended to use as the audience for Travis's testimony. Cormac placed Maeve's leather-bound notebook on the table in the room. He did not raise his voice. He said that before anyone in this room listened to a lie about what rules he had supposedly betrayed, they ought to hear the truth about the man, asking them to believe that lie. Then he opened the notebook to the pages his sister had written, and he read aloud, in the level voice of a man reading the words of someone dead, everything Maeve had recorded. Maeve had not only gathered the things Royce had done to climb higher. In the final pages, written in the weakening handwriting of her last weeks, she had traced back to something older than all the rest, a fire that years before had been called an accident, a house with 2 people inside, a man who had once borrowed money from the organization and had refused to bow. Maeve had written down the name of the man who had given the order back when he was still a young enforcer willing to do anything to prove himself, and that name was Royce Calder. The room grew so still they could hear the snow touching the window pane. They stood perfectly still. She had lived 5 years with the word accident attached to her parents' deaths, and now, in a room behind a warehouse, from the mouth of a man reading the handwriting of a dead woman, she heard the truth she had never known she was missing. Her parents had not died because of an accident. They had died because of an order, and the man who had given that order was standing only a few steps away from her, the very man who had just reached in and frozen her son's surgery, as though the fate of this small family had been tied to him long before any of them had ever known his name. Cormac looked at her when he finished reading, and in his eyes there was something she would need a long time afterward to understand, because he had just realized that the world he had inherited and ruled had killed this woman's parents years before, though not by his hand and not with his knowledge. The two middle-ranking men looked at Royce in a completely different way from when they had entered. In that world, there were rules older than loyalty, and one of them was that no one touched something like that fire and hid it from the man at the top, and another was that anyone who used such things on his own to climb was a danger to everyone else. Royce understood, in that moment, that the throne he thought was beginning to shake had never belonged to him, and that the notebook he had comfortably believed had died with Maeve was now lying open on the table, more alive than ever. He tried to say something, but no one in the room was listening to him anymore. Cormac did not answer the old world with the old road. He did not have to. His sister's evidence had done what violence could never do so cleanly. It had stripped Royce of the only thing that kept a man like him dangerous, the loyalty of the people around him. Royce was taken away by the very men he had meant to use, and the notebook bearing his name and the truth about the fire would be delivered to those with the authority to answer for those old crimes in the way the law answers. Owen was safe. The freeze around the surgery, once the hand that had created it was removed, would thaw along with the man who had built it, and in the room as it slowly emptied, only Delia, Cormac, and a newly exposed truth remained. A truth they would both have to find a way to live with. In the days that followed, Delia carried that truth the way a person carries something too heavy to set down and too hot to hold in her hands. Her parents had died because of an order issued from inside the organization this man now led. It had happened before he took power, not by his hand, not with his knowledge, but it still came from the world that bore his name, from the machine he had inherited and kept running for 10 years. She could not pretend that did not matter. She was not the kind of person who knew how to pretend, and Cormac did not ask her to pretend. That was perhaps what allowed her, in the end, to sit in that house one more time. He did not come to her with polished apologies, did not try to explain that he was innocent, did not once say that because he had not known. He was not at fault. He only said he understood if she never wanted to look at his face again, and that he would not blame her. Then he did the one thing only people who are truly changing can do. He did not talk about change. He began to carry it out. The thought he had not allowed himself to think in the kitchen that morning, the thought of handing everything over and stepping out, was no longer something he kept locked away as forbidden. He began dismantling. He called Bishop Halloran and started the slow, dangerous, irreversible work of removing the most vicious branches of the organization. The branches that lived by choking people like her parents, like Travis, like Delia herself. He could not erase the past. He was honest enough never to pretend that he could. But he could decide that the machine would not crush one more family under his name. And he took the fortune built from all those years, the fortune he knew exactly what it was made of, and he began turning it into something else. He signed the papers to create a fund, and he named it after his sister, the Maeve Fund. He built it on the very things Maeve had sketched out in her notebook, supporting families buried beneath the medical costs of a sick child, erasing debts that his world had piled onto the shoulders of people who could never pay, standing between those families and the cliff he had once helped push people toward. It was not redemption, and he knew that. There was not enough money in the world to redeem the two people who had died in a house years before, but it was a beginning, and it was true in the way words are never true. Delia watched him do all of it, and she understood that the question before her was not whether she could forget, because she would never forget, but whether she could look at a man shaped by the worst thing in that world and choose to see the man he was trying to become. She had spent her entire life wanting to be seen in exactly that way, to be seen not as a debtor, not as a janitor, not as a burden, but as a human being with a dignity of her own. And she knew that if she refused to give him the very thing she had always longed to be given, she would become something smaller than the person she was still trying to be. Forgiveness, she realized, was not saying that what had happened was all right. It had never been all right. Forgiveness was deciding that the worst thing that had ever happened would not be the final thing that defined both people standing inside this story. She did not tell him that she forgave him. That was not the kind of thing she said aloud. But one afternoon, when he sat at the long oak table with the papers of the Mave Fund spread before him, she pulled out a chair and sat down beside him, and she began to read with him. And he understood, without needing her to say a single word, that she had chosen to stay. He offered her the position of executive director of the Mave Fund on a Thursday evening, sitting across from her at the long oak table, and she said no. She said no because the salary was 4 times what she earned mopping floors on the night shift. And she did not believe in being paid 4 times her own worth for work she had not yet proven she deserved to do. He did not argue with her. He did not say that she had walked 10 miles through the snow, and that this had proven more than any degree could. He did not mention that he owed her, or that his world owed her, because he knew that turning this offer into a debt being repaid was the surest way to make her walk out the door and never come back. Instead, he opened a file and placed it in front of her. He did not ask her to feel anything about the numbers inside it. He only asked her to read them. She read that in this city alone, thousands of families each year fell into bankruptcy not because they spent recklessly, but because one of their children became sick, and the price of keeping that child alive was greater than everything they had ever had. She read that most of those families had insurance, and that insurance still was not enough, that the gap between what was covered and what had to be paid was the very gap people like her fell through. She read the numbers about children with the exact kind of illness ordinary treatment plans could not control, about the cost of a surgery like the one Owen was about to undergo, about how many families never reached it for one reason only, money. She read for 2 hours, turning each page one by one. The way a person reads something she has lived inside for years but has never seen anyone write down, because that was exactly what made her stop. Those numbers were not new to her. She had lived inside every one of those numbers. She had been the gap people fell through. She had stood in the financial office on the 2nd floor and listened while someone read her a number she could not pay, and she had walked home because the elevator would have given her too much time to think. The only new thing was that here, for the first time, someone had written those numbers down with a real intention of doing something about them. At the end of the 2nd hour, she closed the file and said yes. She did not say yes because she was grateful. Gratitude was a string, and she had spent her whole life trying not to be tied to strings. She said yes because the numbers were true, and because she was one of the very few people in the world who understood them from the inside, understood them not as statistics, but as sleepless nights and calculations done over and over again on a kitchen table at dawn. She handed in her resignation to the cleaning contractor on a Friday. She started at the Mave Fund on a Monday, but she did not move to Blackstone Boulevard. She did not move into the house with the rows of trees and the 4 stone steps. She kept her 3rd-floor apartment with the heater that still rattled and the window that still let the cold seep through its cracks. She paid her own rent with her own salary, and when he asked why, she said that the day she let someone else pay for the roof over her head was the day she stopped being the person who decided where she lived. He did not argue with that. He had learned, more than anyone in her life had ever learned, that she did not need to be given things. She needed to be allowed to choose for herself. And every morning she still walked to work, down the slope, across streets whose names she knew the way people know the faces of their own children, past the clinic with the porch, where years earlier, a woman she had never met had stood inside and watched her pass, and now she no longer walked past it. She stepped into the building 3 doors away, where that woman's name was engraved on the glass. Owen's surgery took place on a late winter morning, and it succeeded in the way the doctors had dared to hope, but had not dared to promise. And in the months that followed, the seizures that had once shaped his entire childhood became fewer and fewer, then quieted, until the boy began to have things he had never had before. Ordinary days, whole nights of sleep, a future no longer measured by fear of the next thing. He blew out the candles on his 10th birthday cake in the small kitchen on the 3rd floor, a cake covered in blue frosting, with a freight car drawn on top, because he still loved counting them from the bridge near their home, and his sister, who had more truly been a mother to him all his life, stood watching him blow out the candles and did not let him see what was happening on her face. On a Saturday morning, with thin snow falling, Delia left the 3rd-floor apartment and began walking south, along the same road she had taken for so many years. down the slope, across the bridge, past the little store that opened 15 minutes earlier than its sign claimed. Behind her, 70 yards away, a car moved at the pace of a woman walking. She knew. She had known since the second block. They had been doing this for months now. Not every Saturday, not on any schedule, only sometimes he would follow and she would walk, and neither of them spoke about it because neither of them needed to. She did not turn back, not because of pride, not because of the rule she had lived by for years, but because she did not need to turn back. There was something she had learned many months after that first morning, a small thing she had never turned sacred, that the parking lot where she had found the dog lay directly along the old route Maeve used to walk every morning, and that Shep, an old dog used to the scent of the owner who had once taken that road, had perhaps moved toward a woman whose steps carried the same rhythm it had once known. She did not call it fate. She called it one of those circles that sometimes close in a way people cannot find words to name. At the door of the Maeve Fund, she stopped. Behind her, the car pulled to the curb on the other side of the street. The engine went silent. The car door opened and then closed. She heard his footsteps on the sidewalk, then heard them stop. He did not step up to the door before her. He did not reach for the handle. He stood on the sidewalk 6 steps away and waited, because that was what he had come to understand when almost no one else in her life ever had, that she did not want to be invited. She wanted to be allowed. She turned back. He stood there in his gray coat, and the dog was not beside him. Shep was sitting in the back seat of the car with its chin resting on the window ledge, watching both of them with the calm patience of an animal that had outlived the person who named it and had decided that being able to watch was enough. "I'll walk on my own," she said. It was the 4th time she had said those words to him. The first time had been a refusal. The second time had been a boundary. The third time had been a habit. The 4th time was an invitation. "Then I'll walk with you," he answered. They stepped inside. The door closed. The snow kept falling, and the city did not notice. Shep lived several more years, and it passed away peacefully on a November morning, on the pillow on the side of the bed that had once been Maeve's. The tag on its collar, still carved with the 4 words that my name is loved. And if there is one thing that remains after this story closes, perhaps it is this: that dignity is not what is left over when we have lost everything, but what we choose to keep when letting it go would be so much easier, that a human being, even one shaped by the worst things, can still choose to become something else, not because people pity them, but because someone is willing to see the remaining human part inside them, and that the kindest way to help a struggling person is not to decide for them, but to let them decide their own life, to allow instead of bestow. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give another human being is simply to respect the way they choose to walk through this world. If this story has touched something in your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press like, and share so you can listen to many more moving and meaningful stories every day. How do you feel about Delia and Cormac's story? About the woman who chose to walk 10 miles through the snow to hold on to her dignity, and about the man who learned how to let others choose for themselves, instead of handing down favors. We truly hope to hear the feelings deep in your heart. So please leave a few lines in the comments and share them with us. Thank you for listening until the very last moment. May you, the person watching this video, always have abundant health, a joyful life, peace, calm, and happiness every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.